At the start of August 2026, Ukraine reportedly launched 6 FP-5 Flamingo cruise missiles out of Kharkiv Oblast and pointed them at targets deep inside Russia. According to Russian sources, all 6 were shot down, 2 over Volgograd, 1 over Voronezh, 2 over Lipetsk and 1 over Penza. That's 6 launch, 6 intercepted, nothing on target. Now, if you were reading Russian Telegram that morning, the wonder weapon was a dud and Russian air defense had it solved. But in the same week, Russian technicians pulling apart the wreckage found something they weren't expecting. The engine of the Flamingos had changed. For roughly a year, recovered Flamingo debris appeared to show the same Soviet-era AI-25TL engine. That engine was arguably the single biggest thing holding the entire program back. But according to an analysis of recovered fragments, newer Flamingos appear to be flying with a British-made engine instead. On paper, that sounds like a simple part swap. But if this reporting holds up, Ukraine has just removed the ceiling on how many of these things it can build, and depending on which engine it uses, may have added several hundred kilometers of operational range to a weapon that had already reportedly reached 3,000. Let's start with the engine Bottleneck. The FP-5 Flamingo is a genuinely strange weapon by cruise missile standards. It's enormous, coming in at about 12 to 14 meters long with a 6-meter wingspan, roughly 6 tons at launch, and carrying a warhead weighing 1,000 to 1,150 kilograms. For scale, a conventional Tomahawk carries a warhead of roughly 450 kilograms out to a reported range of about 1,600 kilometers. The Flamingo purportedly has more than double the warhead and nearly double the range. But hauling that 1-ton warhead over 3,000 kilometers is not something you do with the small engines you find on cheap long-range attack drones. Physics demands a full-size turbojet. Firepoint's first answer was the AI-25TL. The most important part, apart from its specifics, is that Ukraine had an existing supply of them in the Soviet Union's L-39 Albatros trainers. Firepoint CTO and current CEO, Irina Terek, specifically said the engines came from decommissioned Soviet aircraft. The company's whole design philosophy was built around recycling. It used Soviet-era aviation bombs for warheads, discarded jet engines for propulsion, and a fiberglass and carbon composite airframe you can wind on a machine instead of machining out of titanium. That's how you get a missile that reportedly costs roughly $500,000 per copy, when a Tomahawk cost around $2 million. But there's a problem with building your strategic strike capability out of the scrap heap of a dead empire. The scrap heap of Soviet engines won't refill. Some analysts flagged this problem even before the Flamingo had ever been fired, identifying the AI-25 supply as a potential issue. Back then, the thinking was that there were thousands of engines available that could be fitted onto the FP-5. Once more designs got baked in and the range of engines narrowed, the FP-5 got partially locked into the supply of scrapped L-39s. This meant when Firepoint ran out of airframes to strip, they might as well have run out of missiles. And even the thousands estimate wasn't bulletproof. Firepoint talked publicly about 30 missiles a month, rising toward over 200 of them per month, which could easily break through that number. Now, this is where some clever design principles come into play. If you look at a photograph of a Flamingo, you'll notice the engine sits in its own socket on top of the fuselage rather than buried inside the airframe the way it is on most cruise missiles. While it looks crude, that's exactly the kind of modular design that allowed for the breakthrough in the first place. Mounting the engine externally means you can swap in a different one with only minor modifications to the missile itself. So when the A-25 supply started running dry, Firepoint didn't need to redesign the Flamingo. It just needed to find a different engine in roughly the same weight and thrust class and bolt it on. And it turns out that class is not exotic. When you try to find engines that produce roughly 17 kilonewtons of thrust, which is what the AI-25 does, you find several non-afterburning Western turbojet engines in a broadly comparable thrust class, and most of them are even smaller than the original. Russian analysts either haven't identified which British engine is now flying on the Flamingo, but it's equally likely they already know and haven't said simply because the pool of options is small. Because the actual engine hasn't been publicly identified, we can use the Honeywell TFE-731 family only as a hypothetical comparison. Depending on the variant, the TFE-731 puts out 15.6 to 19.1 kilonewtons of thrust while weighing in at 380-ish kilograms. It's about a meter shorter than the AI-25TL and 15 centimeters narrower. That means the socket needs to be slimmed, which is arguably easier to accomplish. Most importantly, over 9,000 of these engines have been built, and it's actually currently in use. That's the number still in service across a global business aviation fleet with a mature parts and overhaul industry around it. Rather than using a scrap heap, Ukraine might actually get a supply chain to back one of its most ambitious projects to date. This is the main benefit, but it might not be the only one, as Western turbojet in this class are generally more fuel efficient than the AI-25TL. One review notes that the TFE 731-3, while having thrust comparable to the AI-25TLs, burns up to 15% less fuel in similar conditions. If you apply an improvement like that to the Flamingo with the same fuel load and the same payload, the declared 3,000 km range could theoretically stretch by about 450 km. That's an extremely rough theoretical projection using a stand-in engine, and it might depend on what kind of engine actually got strapped into the missile. Now, let's talk about what this missile actually is, because to understand what 450 extra kilometers and an unclogged production line can accomplish, you need to understand how the Flamingo fights. First, it's subsonic, cruising at around 850 to 900 kilometers per hour, with a reported endurance of more than 4 hours. The big part of its improvement is the launcher, or lack thereof, as it uses an open trailer mounted rail. This removes a lot of the manufacturing necessity like folding wings, specialized vehicles or ramps, and drastically improves setup time and possible operational parameters. At the missile's brain, the navigation runs on GPS and GNSS backed by inertial navigation. Reportedly, it even has AI-assisted route planning designed to steer around high-risk areas. And then there's the part that makes it genuinely dangerous. The Flamingo flies extremely low. A video assessment showed that the missile cruises at around 30 meters or lower, following the contours of the terrain. Firepoint's own director, Denise Stielerman, has said it can fly below 20 meters. Why does that matter so much? Because of the curvature of the Earth. Radar technically works only within line of sight. A ground-level radar trying to see an object flying at an altitude of only 30 meters can only detect it out to roughly 21.6 kilometers before the planet itself gets in the way, and that's before you account for hills, forests and buildings along the route. In order to build a continuous detection and interception belt against a threat flying that low, Russia would need radar stations roughly every 30 kilometers at ground level, or every 40 kilometers if they put them on towers. Along a front line that runs the length of Ukraine and a Russian interior that spans 11 time zones, that's simply impractical and out of anyone's budget. Secondly, a 1-ton warhead arriving at 950 km per hour, the FP-5's reported top speed, hits with enormous terminal energy. The combination of high terminal velocity and sheer mass means the warhead buries itself deeper into a structure before detonating, which is what turns an explosion into a demolition. When Ukraine hit the Titan Barricade plant in Volgograd, OSINT analysts examining the damage described collapsed girders, flattened walls, and wrecked heavy machinery consistent with about half a ton of high explosive detonating inside the building. On paper, this is a nightmare weapon. It's got an enormous warhead, range approaching that of some intermediate-range cruise missiles, terrain-hugging flight profile, jamming-resistant navigation, and a price tag a quarter of a Tomahawk's. So let's get into the weapon's track record. Ukrainian sources claimed the first combat use in late August 2025, when at least 3 Flamingos reportedly crossed the Black Sea from the Odessa area and struck an FSB base near Armyansk in occupied Crimea, killing 1 Russian serviceman and damaging 6 hovercraft. That one comes with an asterisk, as the independent Russian outlet Astra confirmed the attack but suggested the weapon might actually have been a long Neptune rather than a Flamingo. From there, the missile went quiet, then reappeared. Ukraine's general staff said Flamingos were among the systems used in January 2026 against a hangar complex at the Kapustin Yar test range in Astrakhan Oblast. And in February 2026, 6 Flamingos went out against targets in Russia and Crimea, and the general staff confirmed a strike on the Votkhinsk machine building plant. This was a core node of Russia's ballistic missile industry, roughly 1,400 kilometers from Ukraine. This was the first time this type of target has been hit by Ukraine, indicating just how important the range-power combination was. After that, the FP-5 hit a bit of a slump, with a few reports of its use suggesting they were either being taken out by Russian defenses or veered off target. Then came June. 5 Flamingos were used to hit the Titan Barakadi Federal Research and Production Center in Volgograd. This was the site that included final assembly of ballistic missile launchers and missile carriers, among them launchers and components for the Iskander-M. One outlet rated it one of the most successful missile attacks Ukraine had conducted in the entire war. A month later, a Flamingo struck the Vyatka machine-building enterprise Avitek in Kirov, more than 1,200 kilometers from Ukraine. Firepoint itself posted a promotional video of the launch. Avitek is a part of the corporation that develops and builds essentially every major Russian air defense system, including surface-to-air missiles and TOR components. According to Ukrainian Defense Intelligence, it also produces the starting gas generators required to light the turbojets used in Russia's own cruise missiles. Sit with that for a moment. A Ukrainian cruise missile burned down a factory that makes the ignition hardware for Russian cruise missile engines. Ukraine's engine problem and Russia's engine problem were being solved by the same thing. So what would the new engine actually change about those missions? Now, before we go on, make sure to subscribe to the Military Show to stay in touch with all the latest events concerning Ukraine's long-range weaponry and more. Back to FP-5 improvements. First and most importantly, there's the salvo size. Several reported strikes have involved 5 or 6 missiles. All Russian air defense has to do is shoot down at least 4 out of 5. But if an engine supply chain lets Firepoint churn out substantially more missiles per month, salvos stop being 5 and start being 15 or 20. And air defense is a saturation problem. Every interceptor a battery fires is one it doesn't have for the next salvo, and radars have a limited number of targets they can track in real time. The difference between 5 inbound and 20 inbound isn't just 4 times possible damage, but the possibility of actually landing a hit. Second, the increased range translates into different targeting vectors, which means more targets become available. It's tempting to hear 450 extra kilometers and think about hitting targets that much farther east. Sometimes that's true, but the more valuable use is spending that range sideways. If we look at one of the failures, such as the 6 missiles launched from Kharkiv Oblast in early August at the start of the show, Russian authorities reported that all 6 were intercepted over Belgorod, Voronezh, Lipetsk and Penza. The flight path passed straight through known concentrations of Russian air defense. That's what happens when you fly the short way. Extra range means you have extra fuel to fly the long way and take unexpected axes. It also means launchers can sit further back from the border, out of reach of Russian counter-battery drones and Iskanders hunting for them. Third, there's another problematic pattern that showed up in how Flamingos were used so far. Starting in 2026, Ukrainian planners shifted Flamingo targeting from southern Russia and Crimea toward facilities deep inside the Russian Federation, specifically along the Volga and the Kama. All confirmed Flamingo attacks by July 2026 hit a target on the shore of a major waterway. One read is that Ukrainian planners figured out the missile does best over water, where it can drop to its lowest operating altitude without hills or towers in the way. That's an elegant solution, but it means the current Flamingo is effectively a river weapon, and Russia can work that out too, and angle its defenses to match. More range and more fuel margin for aggressive terrain following means the Flamingo might just shed its namesake's necessity for rivers and start threatening targets that aren't conveniently located on a shoreline. Fourth, the Flamingo might overcome one of its biggest hurdles, the A-50U. The reason Ukraine's Flamingos keep dying isn't ground radar, as that's taken care of by the design. Instead, it's the radars on aircraft that are tracking these missiles. To push that point further, the Institute for the Study of War suggested that Ukrainian targeting of Russian AWACS, or Airborne Early Warning and Control aircraft, had opened gaps in air coverage precisely during the Volgograd strike. Similarly, the July interception of 5 Flamingos was attributed primarily to a timely A-50U launch, where the aircraft went up and patrolled exactly the areas where ground radar can't see low-flying targets. As for August, Ukrainian assessment suggested that increased A-50U activity made the pivotal 6 for 6 downing possible. There's an important caveat here for this topic in particular, where there are only 5 to 7 A-50Us in the Russian fleet, with one of them being fresh out of the shop for upgrades. And the base A-50 is over 40 years old at this point and has not been produced since the breakup of the Soviet Union. So Russia's counter to the Flamingo depends on putting a handful of practically irreplaceable aircraft in the sky at exactly the right time and place. Even the more optimistic count of 7 aircraft isn't enough to cover 11 time zones. If the Flamingo output triples, Russia can't triple its AWACS fleet in response. The replacement for the A-50 is the A-100, which hasn't even entered serial production, and most outlets suggest a single working aircraft while Ukraine destroyed one radar-less prototype. Which brings us to the strategic picture, and to the reason this story is bigger than one missile. For most of this war, Ukraine's ability to hit anything far away was due to somebody else. When Kyiv started building a real long-range strike arsenal around mid-2023, it was almost entirely dependent on Western partners. Storm Shadow and Scalp EG deliveries from Britain and France were basically it, and donated weapons came with donated strings, as it took months before Ukraine was even allowed to use them inside its own occupied territory, let alone Russia. And even then, there's a possibility that an election turns the tap off. The Flamingo is the answer to that, and its significance is that nobody has to approve it. Ukraine can build it, fuel it, target it and fire it without asking anyone's permission, waiting on an export license, or a foreign parliament debating escalation. But the strongest strategic effect is one of division of labour, which is where the Flamingo touches something like the Patriot. Ukraine's air defense math right now is brutal. In normal months, Ukraine burns through 60 to 70 Patriot interceptors. During concentrated Russian attack waves, that jumps to between 150 and 180, which is nearly 3 times the entire global production. Russia, meanwhile, builds something on the order of 40 to 50 Iskander-Ms and around 10 Kinzhals every month. In early August, when Ukraine failed to intercept any Russian missiles at all, RFE-RL went to Ukraine's European partners and got a wall of polite refusal. Germany declined to comment, Romania called it a matter of national security, and the Netherlands said it had already given everything it could spare. In late July, President Donald Trump declined Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's request for 300 Patriot missiles to protect Ukraine's energy grid through winter, citing US stockpile shortages and the ongoing Iran crisis. But there's another way to stop an Iskander from hitting Kyiv. You can destroy the factory before it becomes an Iskander. That's exactly what a Flamingo did at the Titan Barricadi and in Kirov. Every launcher that never gets finished is a salvo that never gets fired, and every salvo that never gets fired is a stack of Patriot interceptors that never get spent. So offense is the best defense, and critically, the offense side is the one Ukraine can scale domestically with the proposed FP-5 improvements. And there's a version of this that goes further. Firepoint is also developing the FP-7.X interceptor as part of its missile defense project, explicitly aimed at reducing Ukraine's dependence on scarce Patriot PAC-3s. That one has done controlled flight testing but hasn't demonstrated repeated ballistic missile intercepts, and its advantages are cost and production capacity, not performance. It follows the same principle as the Flamingo, where the cost and the ability to field something are better than running out of the crucial resource when you need it. And the Flamingo itself is going across borders, which is important for Ukraine's defences. Ukrainian company Firepoint plans to start producing solid rocket fuel at its own facility in Denmark in 2026. Diehl Defence in Germany has opened talks about producing Flamingos. Firepoint is also working in close partnership with the UK's Millennium Group, and the UAE's Edge Group at one point tried to buy the company outright. If these plans go through and Firepoint can be built better and outside Ukraine, there are 2 main benefits. 1. Flamingo factories located in Europe can't be targeted by Russian missiles. To do so would be tantamount to political suicide, as Russia would essentially declare an open war on NATO itself. In fact, social media conspiracies include one where Ukraine has already been manufacturing parts out of the country and just importing them back in for the finishing touch. Secondly, if Flamingo does reach international cooperation, it means it can reach the international market. Suddenly, it's no longer just a Ukrainian offense-defense system, but a viable long-range strike tool that NATO can use instead of its domestic options. If Ukraine's manufacturing capabilities increase, it can export yet another system to reduce its own spending or reallocate funding elsewhere. Now, the entire story about the engine has some caveats. Everything about the engine change comes from Russian analysis of recovered wreckage, relayed through a Ukrainian Telegram channel. Nobody has publicly identified the engine. The range improvement is based on a hypothetical using a stand-in engine. And Firepoint had already developed a fully domestic turbojet and assembled the first 10 test prototypes specifically to avoid import dependence. So we may be watching 2 parallel efforts: buy Western now, build Ukrainian later. Or we may be watching a company saying different things to different audiences. What we do know is that the Flamingo spent its first year as a weapon that missed more than it hit, and Ukraine kept firing it anyway and kept fixing it. the guidance got better, the routing got smarter, the targeting got more disciplined, and now the one remaining constraint appears to have been engineered around by having the foresight to bolt the engine on the outside. Russia's answer to the Flamingo is just several airplanes. Ukraine's answer to those may be a factory. But beyond that, Russia's aircraft woes keep piling on. To read more, check out this video and make sure you're subscribed to the Military Show for daily